Let's say you've been assigned the task of composing 50 or so pieces for a new video game soundtrack. Heck yeah, sign me up, that sounds great. But here are the catches. 1, you have almost no experience composing for games, and 2, you were composing for the Nintendo Game Boy. This sums up the situation for The Legend of Zelda Link's Awakening, the first and only main series Zelda title for the Game Boy. Faced with this daunting task, composers Minako Hamano and Kozoi Ishikawa develop a soundtrack for a game that is both beautiful and incredibly memorable. The music of Link's Awakening is simply styled and almost minimalist in some regards, even compared to other Game Boy titles like Pokemon Red and Blue and Kirby's Dream Land. With such limited instrumentation and styling, how do you create so much music that remains memorable and interesting? Well, the secret lies in a technique called theme and variation. The concept behind this technique is that you present a certain musical idea, usually a section of melody or harmonic pattern, and proceed to alter it in some way. Common ways of altering can be reharmonization, playing with the timing of notes, and rearranging the melody while preserving the harmony. Theme and variation is used in music everywhere, especially in video games, as a way to create multiple pieces of music that are connected by a theme. Listening to Link's Awakening soundtrack, you'll pick up on several themes which are sprinkled throughout the soundtrack in different ways. Really, the 50 pieces of music can be narrowed down to 30 or so full-length songs, and of these perhaps only 10 are completely original. The others are comprised partly or wholly of variations of themes presented in the original 10. So let's take a look at the opening cutscene of Link's Awakening. The very first piece of music in the game starts off with a clever arrangement of a small section of the original Legend of Zelda overworld theme. Now, it may not really sound like it at first, but we're going to walk through it and see how they could have gone from the original theme to the one in Link's Awakening. So here's the original section as is heard in The Legend of Zelda. Now let's transpose it to C# minor and invert the chord so that the root is now the second note in the measure. Note how the structure of the notes is very similar, but the sound and feel of this phrase is now much different, almost more ominous. Next, let's change the time signature to 5/4 time and modify the timing of some of the notes. We're going to stretch out the first 2 notes, remove the next 2 16th notes, and move the other 16th notes to the end of the measure. Again, the general structure is the same here, but stretching out the musical idea and giving it different timing changes the feel of it further. Lastly, we'll make the last note an accidental, moving it down a half step and repeating it an octave higher. This adds some dissonance to the phrase and removes the nice feeling of resolution we had before. And here we are at the first musical phrase used in the opening piece. We took a recognizable, joyful theme and twisted it into something ominous, swaying, and unpredictable. Such is the power of variation. Additionally, there is an added bass section here that is heavily syncopated with this melody that reinforces its unpredictability and characterizes the dangerous churning sea. This single motif is then repeated, although the last few notes are changed to different accidentals. And then we hear the motif again, but a whole step up. Then the next few measures speed up and truncate the idea and raise the pitch further until there is this musical break. So, in the opening, we've established this motif here. Now what I'm going to do is take this motif and actually create a different one from it that's a little bit simpler and easier to follow. And I'm going to call this opening motif B. And what we'll say is that opening motif A is actually kind of a variation on B, since B is simpler, right? It doesn't have accidentals in it, and it's not in 5/4 time. I'm doing this because in the next few pieces of music, we're going to hear extensive variations on this alternate theme, like right when Marin finds Link on the beach. And later when we awake, there it is again. And finally, leaving the house in search of our lost gear on the shores, we hear the theme most clearly and directly, along with this marching bass presented in 4/4 time. Each measure, the theme is repeated a whole step lower, and every other measure, the eighth notes are substituted for quarter notes. The rest of the piece follows more complex variations that I'll let you try to figure out. So in the first 5 minutes of the game, we've already seen tons of variation on this opening motif, which itself is a variation on the overworld theme from the first ever Zelda game. One of the other themes in the game is the cave theme, which plays in underground or cavernous maps. Let's break this down the same way we did with the opening motif. So the first measure here opens up with this distinct B7 minor chord, followed by 2 quick accidentals. Let's call this cave motif A. The next measure repeats the first, but moves the last 3 notes down a half step. The 2 measures together form a unit, which we'll call cave motif B. Cave motif B is then repeated a whole step up, which is similar to the variations we heard on the opening motif. The next measure, though, jumps up to F sharp and presents a shortened version of the original theme. And the next measure after this is the same, but now a half step up, different from the whole step up before, giving it a different kind of sound. Now let's call these 2 measures cave motif C. The last measure seems to start the original theme again, but introduces something completely new, these 4 descending half steps, which we'll call cave motif D. Now the structure of this piece is similar to those that use the sword search motif. There is this small central idea that is repeating at varying pitches, with occasional shortening and additional elements thrown in. I find it impressive that a single measure of music can be stretched out like this to form a distinct and recognizable piece. This is what I mean when Link's Awakening is minimalistic. It creates very little new musical ideas, instead preferring to manipulate existing ones. Now, the 8-measure cave theme is presented in varying forms within the soundtracks to 5 of the 8 dungeons in the game. Taking a look at the first dungeon, Tail Cave, we hear a simple but interesting variation where the first 4 measures are stretched into 8 by repeating cave motif B, each time lowering or raising the last note a half step. The time signature is changed to 4/4, which gives more of a constant motion, almost as if the dungeon itself has more purpose or importance to it than the random caves scattered over the island. Another interesting variation on the cave theme is the music for Key Cavern, the third dungeon in the game. This piece opens with the cave motif presented way down in the bass clef, stretched out and retimed. Also, the last note has been moved down an octave, but up a half step, giving it this ominous tone that sounds off from the original cave theme. At first listen, it doesn't exactly sound like this, but I'll show you. Here is the motif with the last note where it should be. And here it is with a half step up. And then where it is now. The next time we hear this motif in the song, the last note is again changed, this time to a third below where it should be, forming an absolutely beautiful tritone between the first and last notes of the sequence. Then we hear cave theme A clearly without these pitch alterations, but stretched and retimed similarly to the previous variations in the song. But unlike the original cave theme, the Key Cavern variation goes down a half step first, then jumps into cave motif C almost exactly. Also different from the cave theme is the harmony, which is either this flowing set of triplets or bouncing quarter notes. So the last example of theme and variation I want to cover is the use of variation on the Ballad of the Windfish theme. Now, this theme is pretty special, not only in the context of the game's story, of course, but in its presentation and the way it is varied in different places. So we first hear the theme at the start of the game when it is sung by Marin, or if you aren't that great at Link's Awakening on the Game Over screen. Now, when Marin sings, it's presented plainly without accompaniment. This means two things. The harmony itself is somewhat ambiguous. There is no bass to reinforce the chord, so we can only assume the chord based on the solo voice, which can harmonize to many chords. For example, starting on G major and moving to B minor sounds reasonable. Or we could start on a B minor chord and end up on an E minor 7th. This sounds good too. The other thing the style of presentation means is that the timing is harder to establish. Again, the lack of clear chord changes makes the placement of the strong beats ambiguous, and the prevalence of these long-held notes complicate this further. The timing that makes the most sense is to start on the first half note, having the eighth notes as leading tones. But we could also start the piece here. Or maybe even here? Any of these sound okay without an accompanying voice to shape the exact timing. This ambiguity in rhythm and harmony is good though. It means we can do even more with variation on this very simple melody, making all sorts of cool alterations. Like the Game Over song, which harmonizes to a progression close to the one I suggested in the first example. Or when Link learns the ballad from Marin and accompanies her, this dramatic harmony is used. Also, the timing here has been shifted back an eighth note, lending the piece a more free and fluid-like quality. This is because the strong beat is now syncopated, starting at the end of the previous measure. What's interesting about these variations also is that they are somewhat unpredictable where they are in the soundtrack. Sure, we know the opening motif is heard at the start of the game. When we walk into a dungeon, we shouldn't be surprised to hear the cave theme again, but pieces that vary on the Ballad of the Windfish seem to appear scattered about in many small places. For example, there's this one scene when we unexpectedly stumble across Marin on the beach and get this adorable cutscene with a delicate variation of the ballad. And the Southern Shrine features several of the opening notes of the ballad before departing from the theme in favor of a more melancholy and resolute melody. And even the dark passages of the Windfish's Egg and the intense nightmare battle harken to these same opening notes. And some small music trivia here. The Southern Shrine is actually quite similar in structure to the Hyrule Castle themes from Breath of the Wild. Is this a coincidence, or perhaps a purposeful nod to Link's Awakening? So I hope I've convinced you that the soundtrack to Link's Awakening is inundated with theme and variation, using themes from other games, manipulating those themes within a piece, and using themes across pieces. All of these techniques are found throughout this game's soundtrack. But what does all of this variation mean? What effects does it have on the soundtrack and on the listener? Well, as I mentioned before, variation is an excellent way to link and condense musical ideas. Limiting the number of new themes, but varying old ones, lends a familiar and concise quality to the soundtrack. For example, I find that the dungeon themes are a really nice balance between the copy-pasta dungeon music of A Link to the Past and the dense variety of themes in later games like Twilight Princess. However, this familiarity can be detrimental if the variation isn't interesting enough. A great example is the fourth dungeon in the game, Angler's Tunnel, whose soundtrack is, well, nearly identical to the cave theme. And I'll admit this issue of uninteresting variation happens more often than not. Way too many pieces follow this same format of the taking a motif, repeating it a pitch lower or higher, and repeating it like 20 times. The Owl's theme, the Moblin's theme, Animal Village, the Cave theme, and more than half of the dungeon themes fall back on this easy technique of variation. Although a side effect of this is that when a piece is different in structure and style than these others, it stands out much more, like how the Catfish's Maw departs drastically from the cave theme in contrast to the previous 4 dungeons. Theme and variation is a powerful tool that has been used throughout the Zelda games and lends to the timelessness of the series. I like to think that Link's Awakening was really the first game in the series to widely experiment with this technique, more so than its 3 predecessors. Sure, a lot of its music is simplistic and sometimes a bit repetitive, but you have to remember that this was made for the Game Boy, and it was the first project for the 2 composers. Sometimes simple is simply the best way to go.